everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome back to the We Are Family PMSF Conference Scientific Sessions. We have a great session today focused on nutrition and metabolic supports for the vulnerable brain. So to start this session, we will have one speaker, Dr. Lance Clawson. I will introduce him in a second. And before I introduce him, I will share a brief word from our sponsor. So 1 second while I pull that up.
Our mission at Jaguar is to accelerate breakthroughs in gene therapy for patients with severe genetic diseases.
With gene therapy, we can give the opportunity at a better life. That's what makes Jaguar special.
All right, so without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lance Clawson. Dr. Clawson is a psychiatrist specialized in working with children and adolescents. He has been studying psychiatry all the way from medical school to within the armed forces and in private practice. He has lectured extensively in the areas of psychopharmacology and the treatment and management of ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. He has published on such topics as mental health supports in schools, working alongside pediatricians to provide the best supports, and developing clinical databases for mental health systems of care. He is on teaching faculty in several universities in the Maryland, DC area, and he also specifically has experience with Phelan-McDermid syndrome and was recommended to us by our very own PMS mom, Megan O'Boyle, who that he has expertise in nutritional and metabolic supports for the brain. Welcome, Dr. Clawson. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you very much. Should I start? Great. Well, everybody, thank you for attending, and thank you, Megan, for pulling me into the world of PMS, because it's a perfect fit for me, and I hope that you all find this useful. Although we'll be looking at what we're going to be talking about and our objectives and that type of thing, and this is a really big field, and it's generally not that thoroughly researched, but the evidence is emerging, and there's more and more kind of to support the use of what we call medical foods and other types of supplements. We'll be covering a whole lot of things. We'll cover the methylation pathway, and I don't expect you all to memorize biochemical pathways. But for those of you who are kind of on the nerdier science end, I'll show some of that. And if your eyes glaze over, that's okay. I'll get back to the practical quickly. We'll be talking about...
Dr. Clawson, so sorry to interrupt. We have a request, if possible, to share full screen. Would you be able to...
Yeah, so I can do that. Let's see if that works. Hold on. So let me, hold on, stop the share.
There's an icon for a little slideshow on the bottom right that might make it.
Yeah, I have a complicated setup here. So that means I now don't have access to my share screen. That's the problem. So
if not possible, I think it's still very visible.
Yeah, I mean, if that's a problem, I'd be happy to do that. But what happens is when I do that, it blanks out my screen, so I no longer have access to the Zoom controls.
Okay.
Makes it kind of complicated. So apologies for the limitations. And so anyway, we'll be covering the methylation pathway, which includes all the B vitamins, other cofactors within the methylation cycle, and acetylcysteine, and a variety of other compounds. I said we'll even cover the flavonoids, but we'll probably skip that part. That's way too nerdy, but those are anti-inflammatory agents. We'll also talk about neuroactive and anti-inflammatory compounds, such as inositol and PUFA, or polyunsaturated fatty acids, otherwise known as omega-3 fatty acids, omega-6s. We won't talk about the biome this time, but because there's so much demand to find out the medicinal properties of marijuana and cannabidiols, I'll also touch on that too. So I thought we'd just start with some caveats and cautions, if I can get this to switch. Yeah. So just remember, when you think of big pharma making billions, the medical supplement industry makes probably as much or more money than the pharma industry. So these are money-making enterprises. And so absolute, scientific neutrality, et cetera, can be hard to achieve, but I just want you to keep that back of your mind. And a lot of times when we talk about nutritional supports or medical foods, a lot of people think that they're seen as safer or better for your health, and there may be some realities to that. They don't represent big pharma; they represent supplement companies. They may be free of conflict of interest, which may or may not be true. There may be kind of doctors give too many drugs, so supplements actually feel better to parents. And there's also the no harm, no foul, because if it's safe, I'm not hurting anything. And those all have, they all are relevant to differing degrees and depending on your point of view. But for me, I see medical supplements as a reasonably low risk approach to alleviate symptoms of particular conditions. And also, I often think of them when the medication management gets very complex and you're looking for ways to augment or improve your outcomes without throwing a lot more medication in. And a number of kids are extremely medication support sensitive, and those are often good candidates for this type of thing. Now, medical foods and supplements, they're assumed to be safe by the FDA, but that's not always the case. Natural's not always safer or better. And some celebrated examples are St. John's wort, which was taken quite a bit for depression, which has been found in subsequent studies to not really be of any benefit for depression. But it interacted with the medications that people were taking who had HIV, and several of them died and got very sick. Or we think of fish oil as being a benign intervention, but if you take more than 4 grams or 4,000 milligrams of fish oil a day, you are running the risk of causing excessive bleeding because it interferes with the clotting system. Or too much vitamins like A, D, E, or K. Those are all what we call fat-soluble vitamins. And those can be toxic in very high doses. And a big one that I recall was we used to use L-tryptophan a lot in the late 80s, early 90s for sleep. And then there was a contaminant which killed some people. And so that was taken completely off the market and hasn't really been available since. Also, purity of supplements. So remember, the FDA is not the overseer, so they don't have to prove purity, and it can vary widely. And so that's why you have certain companies trying to show that, trying to demonstrate that they are producing a pure or product, or at least you're buying what they say you're buying. So a good example of Twin Labs. That's a great supplement maker, and they used to make this ECGC, which is really green tea extract. It was felt to be helpful in certain kind of orphan or rare genetic conditions. But when they did analysis of different batches, there was difference between 60 and 95% purity. So you're getting radically different amounts of the ECGC depending on what batch it was in. So that can be an issue. Also, for a number of reasons, but high quality studies, DBPC is double-blind placebo-controlled. That's like the scientific gold standard. They're pretty lacking for the most part. Most evidence, even with good studies, hasn't been widely replicated. And in science, the whole idea behind double-blind placebo-controlled studies is to do a bunch of them so that the preponderance of the evidence shows that it's not just a fluke. For instance, N-acetylcysteine was shown to be really helpful with irritability and self-injurious behavior in autistic kids, but that's the only decent quality study, and it wasn't a very large study. So we can't, it gives us an important signal, but we can't say, oh, absolutely, okay? Whereas when something goes through the FDA, it has to reach a certain standard, which statistical standards or something we call power, and the effect size has to, it has to show that it actually is better than giving a candy pill. So why is there a lack of data? Well, unfortunately, medical economics. And you might feel this in the PMS community as well, is that if you can't make much money on producing a drug or a compound or a supplement by doing the research, because research is very, very expensive. If you can't kind of earn that money back, there's no point in doing the research. And so that's the issue with a lot of supplements and over-the-counter things, is that it really wouldn't pay to spend, a couple, hundreds of millions of dollars on the research, when in fact, because they're supplements and they're assumed safe, or medical foods, that they are kind of a no harm, no foul, so they don't have to prove safety or efficacy. So I just kind of caution everyone, remember, it's like a biologic intervention. You don't do this willy-nilly, and you have to be really systematized in how you do it. And you have to realize any kind of nutritional change you make, a lot of times you're looking at several months of time and observation to really see what the final effect's going to be. Now, there is emerging evidence in basic science and some clinical studies that chronic inflammation or immune system overactivity is a major mental health factor, as well as a major kind of health factor in general for the population. So there's good data and research into major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, Alzheimer's disease, obsessive compulsive disorder, and autism, and to some degree ADHD, showing that there's immune overactivation, or there's some kind of metabolic deficit based on systemic inflammation, and that plays a role. So there's some evidence that treating inflammation directly improves symptoms in some instances. So giving the anti-inflammatory medication, Selexicab, and how it may help major depressive disorder, as well as a lot of anecdotal evidence that treating autoimmunity helps to alleviate certain psychological symptoms. So it's important to realize that modern life is really bad for systemic inflammation. Our diet, how we sleep because of the electric light and because of phones and computers, our lack of exercise, our kind of how would I say, fragmented sense of community and religious connections, as well as these very high stress levels. Because as human beings, we're made to eat lots of plants and vegetables, and to be walking 10 to 20 miles a day, and to be exposed to a lot of potentially lethal bugs and bacteria. And so that's what our bodies are meant to do. And we slept about 12 hours a day. And we don't do that anymore in the modern world. And so there's evidence to show, based on a number of these factors, that perhaps inflammation and systemic inflammation is becoming more of a problem. This has been shown with regards to autoimmunity. So for instance, babies born via C-section versus a natural vaginal birth, that they found that those kids had a much higher incidence of Crohn's disease. And they figured out, oh, they weren't exposed to the mother's biome or her own body bacteria during the birth process. And so now when babies are born by C-section, they take some of the mother's, sorry to be too graphic, but this is a medical lecture, some of her vaginal secretions, and they swab the baby's nose with it. And that reduces the risk of getting Crohn's disease as they get older. There's also a lot of concerns about neuropsychiatric disease, bipolar disorder, depression, ADHD, autism, and dementia being affected by nutritional deficiencies. And that literature's been growing. And so age and diet are being shown more and more to have a big impact here. So I think one of the things that I often scratch my head about are, is some of this data showing that there are people that are just more prone to metabolic or nutritional deficiencies, or are they core nutritional deficiencies in how our diets changed? I think it's probably some of both. There is this CAM movement, complementary alternative medicine, and if you want a reliable source, NIH has its own division of complementary and alternative medicine that you can look at research and find, reputable sources, that kind of stuff. So to look at inflammation in the brain, and I hope you forgive me this, this is the person over here, okay? And we have dynamic experience dependent multi-system brain development, i.e. the growing brain, our brain as it is today, are impacted by all these factors. And so you look at things that really change, that can have an impact, like maternal and paternal diet can have an impact down the line through something they call epigenetics. Maternal and paternal toxin exposure can have an impact down the line, as can stress and adversity. And there's lots of interesting studies to show how the genome is shifted or changed through this, what they call epigenetic process in the parents, so that the offspring are actually affected. I don't know if any of you are science history buffs, but Lamarck was a theorist from France several hundred years ago, and he used to say, well, it's really through experience, like giraffes, grew their neck by stretching, and it kind of affected their offspring. And we always used to kind of say, oh, that's a bunch of poppycock. But the reality is the experience of the parents is to some degree visited upon the children in terms of what genes are turned on and what are turned off. So you can see all of these things, diet, neglect, abuse, insomnia, malnutrition, parental effects affect oxidative stress, inflammation. Corticosteroids are stress hormones that affects the genome directly. And all of these things impact the outcome of the brain. So what we're trying to do many times in this whole kind of more natural approach is to say, how do we, in a non-medicine way, kind of impact these things? Well, some are societal, i.e. malnutrition, and some are environmental, maltreatment and insomnia, and some happen before you even knew you were going to be born. So let's switch to the methylation pathway and we'll start on this. So we're talking about the impact of inflammation on the developing as well as the fully grown brain. And one of the most important ways that inflammation impacts your brain is that it interferes with something called the methylation pathway. The methylation pathway is very important in terms of the function of the cell, the function of neurons. That's how it produces neurotransmitters, through this methylation biochemical pathway. That's how it methylates DNA and demethylates so that it turns different genes on and off. That's how it actually produces DNA and RNA. That's how it promotes neuronal longevity and health. So inflammation can have a lot of significant impacts on the neuron, on the brain, on the central nervous system. And so it's this kind of biochemical function of methylation of certain compounds that I'll show you in just a moment, but I'll start with some kind of get used to it language that has a big impact on the health of the brain. So at the most basic level, when I say methylation, I know that doesn't mean anything unless you remember your chemistry. And demethylation is just the transfer of a methyl group, which is this CH3, a carbon and 3 hydrogens. A very simple structure to and from various bioactive compounds in the body. So these compounds, like proteins and enzymes and hormones and others, must be methylated, have the CH3 group attached in order to function optimally and create other substances required by the body. So all the methylation pathway is talking about is the way in which the body, all these different proteins and cofactors come together, methylate the right enzymes and the right proteins so that the physiological processes and the health of the neuron can continue. So the reason we talk about it is that the methylation pathway is very sensitive to any increase in inflammation within the body, anything that turns on the immune system. Immune system activation can interfere with the normal work of these cellular processes, because inflammation increases what we call free radicals and other compounds which use up these methyl groups, these CH3 groups. And so then the cells don't have them available for use in their usual process. So it's a cellular process which converts crucial molecules to their usable forms. So what is the methylation pathway involved in? I mentioned it briefly, the production of catecholamines, which is norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. Okay, so without that, the tyrosine that we take in through food wouldn't be turned into a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are what it's all about when you're talking about your nervous system functioning. Methylation, as I talked about, of histone proteins affects if they'll be opened up or closed, turned off in DNA. So this methylation process seems to control what genes are turned on and off. And you can see this very clearly, like in data around abused individuals who have a number of, are very high risk for a number of mental disorders, about what genes get turned on and turned off if they go through abuse. But it's the same kind of thing if they have a lot of inflammation in their body. And also methylation regenerates glutathione, okay? And without going too much into it, glutathione is really important because it binds up what we call free radicals. And part of just metabolism in general, free radicals are they're a waste product and they have to be neutralized or cleaned up, okay? So the methylation pathway, and you'll see a big diagram of this, and then you'll say, why doesn't he talk about it? Don't show me the diagram, it's too confusing. But a central molecule in the methylation pathway is something called homocysteine. It's an amino acid. It's just part of, it's produced in this complex cellular methylation process. And the metabolism of homocysteine is really dependent on all these vitamin-derived cofactors that enhance enzyme activity. So for instance, deficiencies in vitamin B12, folate, vitamin B6, all result in increased homocysteine levels. And these vitamins are crucial in the methylation pathway itself. There's a number of other things that increase homocysteine. And what's interesting is that so homocysteine levels in the blood become kind of a proxy for how well your methylation is working in your body. So other factors that raise homocysteine, in high homocysteine is bad, low is good, are poor diet with lots of processed foods, low in fruits and nuts and veggies, lifestyle, which is sedentary, smoking, alcohol use, a lot of coffee use, poor sleep, high degrees of emotional distress, diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, and other autoimmune conditions, advanced age. Our methylation pathway, just like a lot of things in our bodies, don't work as well as we get older. And so homocysteine levels often start to creep up as we get older. Hypothyroidism causes it as well, and certain medications can cause it to increase. So these all create a limitation in this methylation process, which is important for brain function. So we now know that individuals with autism, depression, ADHD, bipolar, et cetera, often demonstrate baseline overactivation in the immune system compared to matched control subjects. So we know that these individuals have higher degrees of systemic inflammation than other people who have just as bad a diet and who are just as sedentary, et cetera. So there is something metabolically about individuals with genetic and developmental disabilities. And we also know that high degrees of inflammation tend to increase homocysteine levels. They kind of go together. So any deficiency or process that interferes with the cellular methylation pathway results in an excessive buildup of homocysteine in the cell. And just so you know, homocysteine, if it's too high, is directly neurotoxic. So that's not good, okay? That means nerves die, brain doesn't work so well. So your homocysteine level is the strongest predictor if you're 65 or older, or even 50 or older, of individuals who will have heart disease and early death, okay? Not related to smoking, cigarettes or having a high cholesterol. So high homocysteine, bad. High homocysteine predicts Alzheimer's and other dementias, declining memory, poor concentration, and lowered mood as we age. So there's this age-related decline in methylfolate levels as well in the brain. And it's made worse by lifestyle and health issues. So this drop in methylfolate's related to high homocysteine levels, as are other B vitamin deficiencies. So, wow, methylfolate. Folate we've heard of, okay? Methylfolate is the metabolic product that your body converts folate to methylfolate so it can be taken up into the brain and utilized in the methylation pathway. So what it seems to be indicating is there are a number of factors, but one of them is just reduced folate. okay? Reduced methylfolate in the brain. So there are a lot of other causes, including we talked about early trauma, environmental pollutants, alcohol, obesity, poor sleep, lack of exercise that increase homocysteine levels. And homocysteine levels are improved through stress management, exercise, and sleep. And we can easily measure these. So we can get these levels. And it can be helpful, but I don't think in terms of clinical use, it's fully standardized, but certainly it's part of the dementia workup for older people. It hasn't been done fully in the autism community or in the genetic difference community, but I think we're getting there. So to summarize everything I said, here you go. Okay, so I apologize. All this is indicating is homocysteine's in the middle, and there's some metabolic cycles here that are very important called the methionine cycle and the folate cycle. And what's important is that you have to have folate coming into the system and being converted to into methylfolate so that it can be fully utilized, so homocysteine can be converted to methionine, okay? And here's the process of methylation here, which is very important to keep this cycle going. We also require methylation here. And you'll see it's just in a different thing, but you'll see there's vitamin B12 and vitamin B6 and a number of these other cofactors here. But all this is really showing you is if we don't keep this homocysteine level down, it's going to go on to really stress the cell out and cause cellular damage and DNA damage. So that was the 10,000 foot view. So now we're getting down a little more closely. So as you recall, as we went back here, there's this folate cycle where folate's brought in, it's converted metabolically and continues around in this cycle, which is essential for keeping the methionine cycle running. And what we know, and there's a lot of work, and probably the most work's been done on folate, methylfolate, is that it can be very useful in cognition and depression. And emerging evidence shows that poor methylators, i.e. people who don't convert dietary folate to methylfolate very well, exist in the population. It's called the genetic TT form. It's called polymorphism of the methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase gene. Okay, you don't have to remember that, but MTHFR. They have a different form of this gene, and they don't really do a very good job of converting dietary folate to methylfolate. And what happens is that's almost a third of the population. They're not very good at it. So during times of stress or poor sleep or lack of exercise or eating too many cheese puffs, it can all lead to methylfolate deficiency, increasing the risk for depression, as well as all these other metabolic concerns you might imagine from letting your homocysteine go too high. There's another third of the population where you've got intermediate methylators, and they can transform folate into methylfolate under normal circumstances, but under times of high stress might have difficulty. And then there are the other third of the population are what we call full methylators. They can transform it easily. So we do know that folate deficiency or low central nervous system folate contributes to brain aging, okay? It increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, basically based on disruption of the DNA RNA methylation pathways is what they think. And severe folate deficiency, even in little kids, will cause a dementia, but it's reversible. So there's all this emerging evidence. In fact, there was recent data to show that suicidal behavior was dramatically decreased in individuals who were being treated for depression if they just had methylfolate added to their regimen. And there's already a lot of good evidence to show that adding methylfolate to depression, and that's becoming very common in psychiatry. But what we don't think about for our kids, if they have autoimmune conditions, if they have developmental disabilities, they may have genetic vulnerabilities, they metabolically may not be operating as well. So we have to think about this. Even if they have folate in their diet, are they transferring it well enough? Are they transforming it well enough? So that's the folate story. But also, interestingly, vitamin B12 is very similar. Vitamin B12 is another important vitamin cofactor that's part of the methylation pathway. And it can cause, it's involved in the methylation pathway, but it's also very important in terms of formation of blood cells. And it can be related to depression and loss of cognition and position sense. In fact, vitamin B12 deficiency is known as like the great, I want to say impersonator. I don't think that's the right word, but you can have a variety of psychiatric symptoms based on B12 deficiency. And we've all heard of people of Northern European descent who have B12 deficiencies, and there are a number of medical conditions which can cause that. But essentially, we have to have, again, methyl B12 for the brain to be able to fully use it. So deficiencies affect methylation much like the way folate deficiencies do. And it impacts neurotransmitter production, DNA methylation, red blood cell production, et cetera. So many of the neurologic symptoms of B12 deficiency are due to degradation of the myelin sheath. I'll show you a picture of that, but that just helps with signal transmission within the nerve. So the data that we have supports supplementation with methyl B12 as helpful in early cognitive decline, depression, and irritability associated with autism. It's not as well studied as folate, but it still is a valuable consideration when we're thinking about how are we going to support individuals who are vulnerable to these types of things. With B12 deficiency, neurologic symptoms can often be more pronounced compared to methylfolate, whereas methylfolate deficiency, you tend to see more depression. And so, but you don't, just because you have a relative reduction in, you know, a B12 level that's kind of a bit low and not optimal, it doesn't mean you're going to have these neurologic symptoms. Your levels have to be pretty low to get those. Other factors, iron and magnesium are important, okay, because the enzyme that converts folate to methylfolate doesn't work very well without that. Also, just as an aside, ADHD symptoms do better if you supplement them with, their sleep is better and they function better if you supplement them with iron if they have low normal ferritin levels. So back to the methylation pathway, this is the same thing. This is a different way to look at it. I just wanted to show you, here's where B12 is important. B12 is important here. B2 riboflavin is very important there. Vitamin B6 is very important here. Dietary choline, all of these things are very important in terms of a nutritional basis. The trick is that, and what I'm talking about here when we're talking about medical foods, is that we're not just giving people vitamins. When you're talking about medical food intervention, I'll talk a little more in a second, you're actually taking in the methylated B12 and the methylated folate so that it can be absorbed directly into the brain and utilized. All right, other cofactors, I just showed you a picture of B6. It's also involved in the methylation pathway. Low levels can cause increased homocysteine. And interestingly, there was a recent study that showed that B6 supplementation also alleviated depression. So, I mean, it's no surprise. This is all part of one big metabolic cycle. And if you have a shortage anywhere along the line, you're going to interfere with cellular metabolism. Individuals can become more vulnerable to stress and inflammation and have the deleterious effects. And so it's not always easy to know which of these an individual might require or need. There isn't really always a good test for it. And just remember, taking too much B6 is not always better. It's toxic over 200 milligrams a day. Also B2, riboflavin, that's also involved in the cycle, just in exactly the same way. It's also great for your skin. Neurologists use it all the time for treating of migraine headaches. Also, choline is an essential nutrient, and it's necessary for the normal functioning of cells. And I'm not necessarily saying, oh, we need to supplement all these things, but it's also a focus on where we have to have healthy lifestyle, healthy diet. And some of these things may be important to supplement, particularly the things that rely on a metabolic conversion in order to be usable by the neuron. And choline deficiency can cause disorders across a number of systems. And we'll be talking about it. Phosphatidylcholine is important for the cell membrane as well as cell health. And you've all heard of SAMe. That's been used for depression. And I don't know if you can, we'll see it right here. Is SAMe there? Well, SAM is, S-adenylmethionine. SAMe is right in here. And so if you add this into the system, you're actually bypassing the whole cycle, and you're putting it in, you're getting increased DNA lipid methylation, as well as keeping the system going. So SAMe kind of sidesteps this whole thing, but it's required for cellular growth and repair. It's also involved in biosynthesis of several hormones and neurotransmitters. And it has a strong impact on catecholamine, norepinephrine and dopamine and serotonin production, that taking it has been found to be helpful with depression. But if you take it with a regular antidepressant, you can get sick from too much serotonin, called serotonin syndrome. So you actually have to be careful when you're taking SAMe. A lot of people feel like, oh, wow, I'll take SAMe instead of an antidepressant. And it's an interesting proposition. It might be helpful to some people. It won't be helpful to all. But you just have to exercise caution, because once again, you're taking something that has a strong medical effect that you won't know completely, you won't necessarily have all the data about purity and things like that. So I tend to shy away from SAMe, because if you're taking SAMe, in my book, you probably benefit from an antidepressant at that point. So probably a million questions here, but we'll keep moving, because we could easily run out of time. We have till 2, right? I think so.
Yes, I think we would love to save some time for questions. So maybe one.
So I'm going to end in about 12 minutes. Okay.
Thanks.
So what do? Do we supplement? Do we test for levels? Do we measure homocysteine? Do we do the genetic testing? Do we measure inflammation? Yeah, we can. And there's no easy answer. Blood levels don't always reflect brain levels. So if you test your folate or your B12 level, that doesn't necessarily indicate if you absolutely have enough methylfolate or methyl B12 in the brain. But I think there's enough growing evidence in autism, ADHD, and dementia that a lot of folks are using particularly methylfolate and methyl B12 as helpful. And so I can answer questions about sources, but different sources are Enlite, Serfolin, NAC, Deplin, generic methylfolate. There's a million of them on the market now. So I'm going to take you through polyunsaturated fatty acids very quickly. And then I'll kind of, and then there's a lot of other things we can talk about, but I don't want to use up all the time. But just very quickly, that's polyunsaturated fatty acids are what everyone talks about with fish oil and omega-3 fatty acids. And the bottom line is you get this from dietary sources. It can come from animal or plant sources. Where are we? Animal or plant sources. And there's a particular structure. And the important thing to know about these is that they are part of the cell membrane. They help regulate cell membrane fluidity, modulate cell survival and cell growth. They help enhance cell-to-cell communication. So they're of central physiologic importance. And what you need to know is this is a visual thing. What's important is this is a saturated fatty chain. This is a saturated fat. It's a straight chain. Polyunsaturated or unsaturated fatty acid has a kink, has a little turn in it. This little turn is of great significance. Just so you know, this is where you get your sources of omega-3s. You want to minimize, our diets have become exceedingly high in omega-6s. So we want to maximize where we can get omega-3s from, in addition to just taking omega-3s. So this is just to show you that little kink, that double bond in the omega-3s. This is saturated lipids. When they line up, this is a cell wall membrane. This is a very tight, non-fluid, non-mobile kind of cell membrane. Whereas here we've got a little bit of space, so things can move across and through, and that's very important for cell health. So omega-3s can move they are anti-inflammatory and they're kind of pro-cell health. The important one is that EPA has been shown to be helpful in depression and ADHD, and it is anti-inflammatory through the fact that it blocks the production of what they call arachidonic acid. And it by doing this, reducing neuronal inflammation, it probably is why it has the positive effect in ADHD and depression that's been shown. It also, we talked about that. And then there's DHA, which is the other omega-3 fatty acid. And just so you guys know what these things stand for, I can't say. EPA is eicosapentaenoic acid, and DHA is docosahexaenoic acid. So that's why I don't say the whole thing. So I'm confusing you here. I apologize. And DHA also reduces the production of arachidonic acid, but DHA is a larger molecule. And so when it takes up residence in the cell wall, it's a larger molecule. So it allows the cell membrane to be more fluid and transport nutrients as well as neurotransmitters and other things through it. And it also helps break up what they call lipid rafts. So it helps keep the cells kind of mobile and keeps them from becoming too rigid, and therefore interferes with their metabolism. And all I'm showing you here is a picture of what a cell membrane kind of looks like. And these are the little polyunsaturated fatty acids attached to a phosphatidylcholine or phosphatidylserine head. And they just form what they call the lipid bilayer. And the more little kinks you have in there, the more fluid the bilayer for these types of things to move through. And it's very important to see that receptors and proteins, they shift and move. And if you have these larger DHA molecules here, it leads to improved cell membrane function. So it helps. It really looks like the DHA helps with cognition, and there's a lot of data supporting this, some of it being more, how would I say, more robust than others. And so I wanted to jump to the chase here, because what a lot of people have been doing is taking fish oil. Well, fish oil is great. It has omega-3 fatty acids, but fish oil then has to be broken down by the body completely into the separate, because each fish oil has 3 omega-3 fatty acid chains on it. It has to be broken down into, and then 2 omega fatty acid chains have to be attached to a phosphatidylserine or phosphatidylcholine group. So that's a very involved process. Some people may do it better than others. So when we give phosphatidylserine omega-3 or phosphatidylcholine omega-3, which you can buy on the market, you actually are giving that material which the brain uses directly. So theoretically, giving the phosphatidylcholine or serine should be superior to giving fish oil. It doesn't have to be converted or metabolized. No one's done that study, okay? But there has been research done with phosphatidylserine and phosphatidylcholine to show its efficacy in cognition as well as ADHD. And an interesting study out of NYU, one source of phosphatidylserine in a double-blind placebo-controlled study of another rare disease, showed that the genetic retinal degeneration was slowed dramatically by utilizing this. There's lots of different sources of this, and some supplements will contain it. Enlight's one, Sharp Thought's another, BioBody PC. There's tons of it there. A lot of it's from animal sources, and the stuff that shows the most robust findings are usually from animal sources versus plant sources. So you do have to kind of take a look at that. That's not well researched. But phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylserine are something that I do use often as a cognitive enhancer for individuals. Briefly, N-acetylcysteine, I want you to know about. This is also an anti-inflammatory, an antioxidant, and it's a naturally occurring amino acid. and can be used therapeutically. It's been shown in a number of studies to help with depression, OCD, irritability associated with autism, et cetera. And it does two things. It regulates kind of glutamate and dopamine activity in the brain, so the brain's not too overexcited. And it also helps manage inflammation within the brain. And so N-acetylcysteine has a lot of data to support it. And I can provide my slides for people who want to see this, because we've got about 4 more minutes and I know you're going to have questions. One last thing I want you to hear about is inositol, which is a inert sugar, which has been used in higher quantities, not as an anti-inflammatory, but is actually something as a little bit of a neurotransmitter intermediary compound. And it's been shown to be helpful in bipolar disorder and OCD as well. There are others you might have questions about, but I wanted to get to the last part because everyone always wants me to give them a marijuana card. And this is a tough one. So cannabidiol, CBDs, and tetrahydrocannabinols. And I'll keep this very straightforward and simple. There are like over 200 molecules contained within marijuana plant, okay? There are cannabidiols, tetrahydrocannabinols, terpenes, et cetera, et cetera. If you walk into a dispensary, they're gonna give you all kinds of non-scientific pot talk is what I call it, about how this helps with that and that helps with that. And there's not even control over the strains, so you actually don't know what helps with what. And buying the same strain every time may or may not be helpful because it's not that closely regulated. But I just want you to know that THC, i.e. the part that makes you high from smoking marijuana, there has been so far with all the research that's been done, it's not, the final chapter, but there's been no evidence that it treats any particular psychiatric or neurologic condition. I just want you to know that there's zero evidence to support it. There's relatively strong evidence that it can treat a broad array of psychiatric and neurologic conditions. There's strong evidence it can create psychosis early and late life, and cause potentially permanent cognitive impairment in teens and young adults, and worsen depression and possibly anxiety. It also increases the risk of stroke. So why do we use it? Well, I don't often use it. I've been desperate in a few cases and I have used it, because sometimes being high with the incumbent risks beats the life-threatening self-injurious behavior or something like that. But I really do hold off on this if at all possible. Now, CBD is a different story. There's a growing body of evidence that shows it can be helpful. FDA's approved it for childhood seizures. Some evidence that very high doses it may treat schizophrenia. And they think that actually the CBD plus the THC, the CBD is what protects you from the psychosis when you're smoking regular weed. But unfortunately, these cultivars, have very high levels of THC, so you may not be protected. May treat social anxiety, also may reduce craving of opioids, and may help with treating cannabis use disorder, okay? And it's also been shown to have some maybe immune suppression, anti-inflammatory effects, but we don't know much about it. So CBDs are being investigated and useful, but there's a lot we still don't know. We don't know how long they last. We don't know what doses, and that type of thing. But it doesn't mean I don't use them. But what I have found using them over a few years is, for whatever reason, the initial impact seems to wear off. Now, I don't know what that means, whether the initial was placebo or whether it just doesn't have a long-term impact. But there is a role for these potentially, and it's growing. But I just want to exercise caution. As with all supplements, know your source, look for third-party labs that have been evaluating the compounds and for purity and safety. And there aren't any silver bullets, but some of these compounds can be very helpful. But so I just took you on a very rapid trip. I'm sorry I couldn't go through all of it. And I'm going to stop sharing and we'll go to questions. How's that?
Thank you so much, Dr. Clawson. That was fantastic. I
know it's a little overwhelming. I'm sorry.
No, it was great. I know I learned a lot, and I know that our attendees learned a lot. So we will open up questions now, and I will pose them to Dr. Clawson. Please put these in the Q&A and not the chat. We already have one, and Dr. Clawson talked about this a bit in the beginning, but supplements aren't regulated. So are there certain things to keep in mind when you're looking at manufacturers for determining higher quality? And since supplements can be expensive, are you aware of any, financial assistance programs in these areas?
Okay, so therein lies the rub. Some people are spending more on supplements with unknown efficacy than than all their other medications put together. So I'm not aware at this point of financial assistance for supplements, and in general, insurance won't pay for it. I am aware that if your child has Developmental Disabilities Administration support because they have intellectual disability, that if you have what they call a self-directed budget, that supplements can be paid for. And so that actually could be a huge help to the folks, but that doesn't kick in until the kids are 22, unless you have autism waiver services or something like that earlier on, but it is possible. There was one other part, purity. Usually there are some good websites that really evaluate these different supplements for purity, third-party labs. And so you can look at, actually look up a particular compound and just say, what's the assessment been? And you can Google that and find, has a third party come and assessed it for, is it really what they say it is?
Excellent, thank you. We have a few more questions already. One of them is, do you feel there's a basic panel of tests that are reasonable to get for PMS kids to evaluate baseline metabolic health and directions for intervention?
Well, I am sure a lot of physicians will have different opinions, but when we're looking, it's difficult because some of these tests are not always readily available. And then some of them that are available through some of these other labs haven't been fully necessarily standardized or, established within the medical community. So you'll get a really fancy test, but what does it really mean is the hard part. I would say kind of, if you wanted to check a homocysteine level, and if that looked up, I'd be all over that, because that's actually a fairly significant sign that's used regularly. I would just check basic vitamin levels, D, folate, B12, just to make sure that we don't have any frank deficiencies. But when you look at kind of how medical foods are done, you're kind of, say when you give methyl B12 or methylfolate, you're kind of slamming the brain with lots of extra so that there's no chance of a deficiency of that. So a lot of times when I'm giving kids these supplements, I'll check their B12 level or their folate level, and they're pretty high simply because I'm giving them a lot of that compound. But you have to be systematic. You give it, it makes a difference or it doesn't, okay? But you have to give it 2 or 3 months.
Yep. Thank you. The next question is, what role does Carnotaur play in metabolism?
That's a very complex thing, but Carnotaur is, and ubiquinol and a bunch of others are important for mitochondrial metabolism. So that's the energy machine of the cell. And so some of these supplements, ubiquinol, Carnotaur, carnitine, and Carnotaur is also used because if your kid takes Depakote for seizures or behavioral reasons, it tends to suppress the levels of carnitine in the blood, and that does potentially interfere with the metabolic health of the cell, not through this methylation inflammatory process, but just in terms of generating energy for cellular function.
Thank you very much. The next question is, do certain supplements require something taken alongside them in order to turn them on or make them more effective? Is there an evidence that too much or dangerous combinations for some supplements? And I think you touched on that a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I think you need to be wise about you're not going to overdo B6. You're not going to overdo A, D, E, and K. Fortunately, vitamin D, when people do supplement that's become very common. Although the data is a little weak, still all internists do it because as we get older, our vitamin D levels drop, just like our CNS folate levels drop, just as our homocysteine levels go up. So you can test for those levels, but you want to be careful of fat-soluble vitamins and too much vitamin B6. In combination, that's a really good question. Usually, what you're concerned about is if you're like giving calcium with iron and those types of things because they bind each other and they interfere with each other. But in general, there hasn't been any data that I'm aware of to show that it's problematic to dose them all together. And one of the producers, a biochemist, created this Enlight, and it's got everything. He just said, I looked at the methylation pathway and I decided you never know what someone's deficient in, so I put everything in there. So it's actually a multivitamin that has all of the elements and all the cofactors. And there's been no evidence in what they've done in follow-up that there's any difficulty taking these things all together.
There actually was a question that was somewhat similar to that, asking if you can supplement with B complex, for instance.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with B complex. If your child or you are metabolically, middle of the road, so to speak, that should be fine. The reason for the methylfolate and the methyl B12 that's contained in Enlight or Cerefolin, the reason for that is that it bypasses your body's need to transform the dietary vitamin over to the brain-ready form. So what the whole idea in the strategy is to give the brain-ready form, just like instead of giving fish oil, you give the phosphatidylserine omega-3, and the brain takes it up and utilizes it directly. Because what we don't know, and often what we can't measure, and that's why this field's very imprecise, you have to try something and then see what happens, is the individual in question, the patient in question, we don't know where their roadblocks are. And these are very complex pathways. So that's why most of the approaches have been giving a lot of different compounds together. Although what's interesting with the methylfolate research and some of the methyl B12 research is that even given alone, they can be beneficial.
Thank you very much. There's another question that says, PMS kids suffer from constipation. Do any of these recommendations of supplements contribute to constipation?
They should not. I'm thinking of all of them. The only thing that you would usually associate with constipation would be excessive iron. And some of the kind of multivitamin, brain-ready types of things have some iron in them, but it's usually a relatively small amount. It's in the form of iron glycinate, which is then utilizable directly in the methylation pathway. It doesn't have to be transferred over to, from iron sulfate to iron glycinate.
Perfect. We don't have any new questions. I'll give it 1 minute. Oh, I do see a new one. PMS individuals may be prone to zinc deficiency. What is the role of zinc in these metabolic pathways, if any?
Zinc is not directly involved in the methylation pathway, but it's absolutely fascinating because zinc actually has a role, because zinc is an anti-aggressive and an anti-impulsivity medication. And so when you looked at British prisoners who were given zinc fortified bread, their rates of violent infractions in the prisons dropped like 50% when they were given zinc fortified bread. And there's some good evidence to show that zinc, when given, does treat ADHD as well over a period of about 4 hours. The trick with zinc is you don't want to overdo it. I've had some people come in on dangerously high levels of zinc. So I think I'm trying to remember that. I think it was 18 milligrams. That kind of, high teens to mid 20s in terms of milligrams of zinc are okay, but you don't want to overdo any of these metals, so to speak.
Very interesting. We don't have new questions. I will give it 30 seconds. If anyone has one last question, we could maybe do one. Sometimes they trickle in, so if anyone's nervous to ask.
And if anybody wants slides, I'm happy to shoot them the slides. That's fine.
And the recording will be shared in the conference app too, and I'm sure there's even more details on the slides.
Yeah, and there's a lot of references, and it's not an exhaustive list. It's just to kind of get people, started.
Absolutely. This is not one that I know something about, so I apologize if I mispronounce. Somebody says, do you have any input about astaxanthin? I'm not sure.
Can you spell it?
ASTHAXANT.
Oh, that. Yeah. I'm just starting to look into that. From Hawaii, about 30, close to $40 a bottle. Oh, that is being recommended by all kinds of people as something that enhances cellular metabolism, gives you beautiful skin. And basically the claims are as long as my arm. Okay. And what we don't know, so I mean, I am familiar with it. I'm starting to kind of look at that as one of the many, many different things. But I mean, there are so many compounds, because remember, whenever there's something that's crucial in a metabolic pathway, you could potentially take it for a therapeutic purpose. What matters is that involved in some deficiency or some kind of suboptimal metabolic pathway that you have, whether it's going to help you or not.
Thank you so much. And somebody is asking for a copy of the slides. So Dr. Clawson, if you wouldn't mind just sending those to me, and then we could.
Yeah, I'll send them to you. That's great.
If you're comfortable with that, we'll make them available.
Yeah, there's nothing in there that's going to change the world, but it's all interesting to me.
Well, thank you so much. I think we'll stop there. We're a few minutes past the hour. We so appreciate you joining us. We know you're so busy, and we all learned a lot. So thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right.